The morning started the way most did for Grace Turner. Too early, too cold, and too quiet. Her alarm buzzed at 5:30 a meter, the dull hum of exhaustion echoing through her small apartment on the west side of Chicago. The coffee maker sputtered to life while she packed her son's lunch. A peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, and a handwritten note that read, "Remember, you can do anything if you try." She always wrote something like that. Maybe more for herself than for him. Her son Lucas shuffled into the kitchen, hair messy, pajamas wrinkled, clutching a toy car. "Mom," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "You forgot the smiley face." Grace laughed softly and drew one on his napkin. "There, happy now?" He grinned. "Yep, you're the best mom ever." The words hit her like sunlight breaking through clouds. She smiled, though her heart ached knowing how fragile their little world was. Rent was late again. The fridge was half empty. And she'd been warned that another tardy at work might cost her the job. But today felt different, hopeful, even. The streets of Chicago glistened under a thin veil of rain as Grace hurried down the sidewalk, her umbrella barely holding against the wind. She worked at the Whitman Grand Hotel, one of the city's most prestigious five-star establishments. All marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and guests who never looked people like her in the eye. Her shift started at 7 a.m. sharp. She was halfway there when a sudden commotion broke her rhythm. Across the street, an elderly man stumbled out of a café, his steps faltering. Before anyone could react, he collapsed on the wet pavement. "Sir!" Grace shouted, dropping her umbrella and sprinting toward him. Cars honked. A cyclist swerved. No one stopped. Grace knelt beside the man, her heart racing. His face was pale, his lips trembling, breath shallow. "Please, stay with me," she said, pulling off her coat and placing it under his head. "You're going to be okay." She looked around frantically. "Someone call 911. A teenager nearby fumbled for his phone, shaking. Grace pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, faint pulse, irregular. She remembered the CPR class she'd taken years ago when Lucas was born. Hands interlocked, firm pressure. 1, 2, 3. She whispered, counting compressions, rain mixing with tears she didn't realize she was crying. After what felt like hours, an ambulance siren pierced the air. Paramedics rushed over, taking control. Grace stepped back, soaked, trembling, breathless. One paramedic turned to her. "You did good, ma'am. You might have saved his life." She nodded weakly, relief flooding through her. "Will he be okay?" "Looks like a heart attack. But he's got a chance, thanks to you." They loaded him into the ambulance. Grace stood there, drenched and shaking, watching the doors close. She didn't even realize how late it was until she glanced at her phone. 7:24 a meter. Her stomach dropped. "Oh God," she whispered. "I'm dead." By the time she reached the Whitman Grand, her shoes squelched with every step. She raced through the service entrance, praying to slip into her uniform unnoticed. But fate had other plans. "Grace Turner!" The voice snapped like a whip. Linda Morales, the housekeeping supervisor, stood at the end of the hall, arms crossed. Her immaculate blazer and heels were as sharp as her tone. "You were supposed to clock in 25 minutes ago," Linda said. Something happened," Grace stammered. "There was a man, he collapsed in the street. I had to." "I don't care what happened," Linda interrupted coldly. "You know the rules. Mayor Whitman made it very clear. No more exceptions. Please, Linda, it wasn't my fault." Enough." Linda's eyes flicked down to Grace's soaked clothes. "You're dripping all over the carpet. Go to HR." Grace felt the air leave her chest. "You're firing me?" Linda hesitated, voice softening for just a moment. "It's not personal." "Orders from above." Grace blinked back tears. "I just saved someone's life." Linda sighed. "Then maybe you should have worked at a hospital." The HR office smelled of vanilla candles and pretense. Grace sat across from a young woman who avoided her eyes while reading from a script. "Ms., Turner, due to repeated tardiness and violation of attendance policy, your employment with Whitman Grand Hospitality Group is hereby terminated. Effective immediately. Grace swallowed hard. Please, I'm a single mom. I need this job. The woman gave a rehearsed sigh. I understand, but the decision is final. Grace's throat tightened. At least let me explain. I wasn't late because I overslept. I helped an elderly man who... Ma'am, if you'd like to appeal, you can file a request in writing. Grace stood, shaking. Forget it. She walked out, uniform clutched in her arms, tears blurring the golden lights of the lobby. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the city felt colder than ever. She sat on a bench near the train station, trying not to break down. Her phone buzzed. Lucas, mem, can we get ice cream after school? Grace stared at the message, heart splitting. She typed back, of course, sweetheart, then wiped her tears and whispered, somehow. That evening, Grace tried to act normal. She made spaghetti, helped Lucas with homework, read him a story about heroes and bravery. When he finally fell asleep, she sat by the window, staring at the city lights. Somewhere out there, rich people were drinking champagne in penthouses, the kind of people she cleaned up after. People who never saw the faces of those who served them. She didn't know it yet, but one of those people's lives was the very one she'd saved that morning. Across town, in a private hospital suite overlooking Lake Michigan, George Whitman slowly opened his eyes. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside him. A nurse smiled when she saw him awake. Well, good evening, Mr. Whitman. You gave us quite the scare. George's voice was raspy. What happened? You collapsed near Oak Street Café. Cardiac arrest. But a woman performed CPR until paramedics arrived. You're lucky she was there. George blinked slowly. A woman? Do you know her name? Grace Turner, the nurse said, checking her chart. She said she worked at your hotel. George's brow furrowed. My hotel? Yes, sir. The Whitman Grand. George closed his eyes again, thinking. His son, Ethan Whitman, had taken over operations years ago. The boy was brilliant and cold. He'd turned the company into an empire, but somewhere along the way, he'd lost something essential. George murmured, Grace Turner. He made a mental note, find her. Meanwhile, in a corner office overlooking downtown, Ethan Whitman reviewed quarterly reports on his laptop. Numbers, graphs, projections, all immaculate. His assistant entered quietly. Sir, HR reports we terminated a housekeeper this morning. Grace Turner. Repeated tardiness. Ethan didn't even look up. Good, set an example. Standards matter. Yes, sir. He went back to typing, unaware that the woman he'd just dismissed had kept his father alive. The next morning, Grace was at the unemployment office. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the sea of tired faces. She clutched her application form, trying not to cry again. Miss Turner? The clerk called. She approached the desk. The woman behind it scanned her file. You've got a good record. Maybe we can help you find something else. Grace nodded faintly. Anything. I'll take anything. As she signed the paperwork, her phone buzzed again. An unknown number. Hello? Ms. Turner? A warm male voice said. This is Dr. Keller from St. Mary's Hospital. You don't know me, but I'm calling on behalf of a patient, Mr. George Whitman. He asked to see you personally. Grace frowned. George Whitman? Yes, ma'am. He said you saved his life yesterday. Her heart skipped. I just did what anyone would. He doesn't think so. He'd like to thank you in person. Grace hesitated, unsure. The name Whitman echoed like irony. Of course, she said finally. I'll come. That afternoon, Grace stood nervously outside the hospital room. Through the glass, she saw the man, frail but alert, his white hair neatly combed, a kind smile spreading when he noticed her. Miss Turner, he said softly as she entered. "Come in, please," she did, unsure what to say. He extended a trembling hand. "You're the reason I'm alive." "Thank you," Grace blushed. "I just did what I could, sir." "You did more than most," he said. People walked by. "You stopped." He studied her face. "You said you work at my hotel?" She froze. "I did. I was fired yesterday." His brows lifted. "Fired? For what?" "For being late," she said, half laughing through disbelief. "Because I stopped to help you." George stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "My God." He pressed a button on the table, calling for his assistant. "Get me my son," he said. Immediately. Back in the downtown office, Ethan Whitman was in the middle of a board meeting when his phone buzzed. Seeing his father's name on the screen, he stiffened. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he muttered, stepping into the hall. "Dad, Ethan," George said. "I'm at St. Mary's Hospital." "What? Are you okay?" "I'm fine now, thanks to a woman named Grace Turner. She works for you. Or at least she did." Ethan frowned. "I don't recall." "You fired her," George interrupted, voice rising. "Yesterday morning." Ethan rubbed his temples. "Dad, I can't personally review every termination." "You should review this one," George snapped. "Because that woman saved my life. While you were too busy counting profits." Silence crackled over the line. "Come see me," George said finally. Now, that evening, as Grace left the hospital, she felt something she hadn't in days, a faint spark of hope. George had insisted on helping her somehow. "You'll hear from me soon," he'd said. But even if nothing came of it, she was grateful. For the first time, someone had looked at her not as disposable labor, but as a human being. She walked home under the streetlights, thinking of Lucas, of the world she wanted for him. Behind her, high above the city, two men were about to have a conversation that would change everything. Ethan arrived at the hospital with his usual precision, pressed suit, expensive watch, eyes sharp as steel. But when he entered his father's room and saw Grace sitting beside the bed, something in him faltered. "Dad," he said cautiously. "You should have called sooner." "I would have," George replied dryly, "if my heart hadn't stopped." Ethan ignored the jab, turning to Grace. "You're Miss Turner?" She stood, nervous. "Yes, sir. My father says you saved him." Grace nodded quietly. He hesitated. "Thank you." George's gaze hardened. "She was one of your employees," Ethan frowned. "Was?" "She was fired yesterday." Ethan's eyes flicked toward Grace. "For what reason?" "She was late," Grace said simply. "Because I stopped to help someone." George's face reddened. "That someone was me." The room went still. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "I had no idea." "That's the problem," George said sharply. "You don't see people anymore." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You built this company on discipline, Dad. I'm just maintaining it." "I built it on decency," George snapped. Discipline came after. The silence that followed was heavy and raw. Grace looked between them, unsure whether to leave. George turned to her. "I'm sorry for what my company did to you." Grace shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, sir." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But I intend to make it right." When she left the hospital that night, the sky had cleared. Stars pricked through the darkness above the lake, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain and hope. Grace didn't know what awaited her. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But as she walked down Michigan Avenue, shoes still damp, heart still heavy, she whispered to herself, "You did the right thing." Somewhere behind those glittering windows, power and conscience had collided. And for once, it wasn't the powerful who held the upper hand. The following morning broke with the faint glow of dawn filtering through the hospital blinds. George Whitman sat upright in bed, a stack of company reports and a breakfast tray untouched beside him. His assistant, Michael, hovered near the door, looking uneasy. "You wanted to see me, sir?" George didn't look up. "Yes, bring my son here again." Not later. Now. Michael cleared his throat. Ethan's in meetings all morning. He said he'll visit this evening. George's voice cut like ice. Michael, I built this empire before Ethan knew how to tie a tie. If I say now, it means now. The assistant nodded, left quickly, and made the call. Across town, in the mirrored glass tower of Whitman Global, Ethan Whitman sat in a conference room surrounded by executives. Charts glowed across the digital wall display. Quarterly growth, occupancy rates, expansion projections. Everything looked perfect. Except his father's voice from the night before still echoed in his mind. You don't see people anymore. He forced himself to focus. The Singapore property is ahead of schedule, he said, flipping through a report. Keep margins tight. Cut any redundant staff. One executive hesitated. Sir, morale doesn't pay the bills, Ethan snapped. Efficiency does. The room fell silent. Then his phone vibrated on the table. A single message from his father's assistant. Urgent. Your father insists on seeing you immediately. Ethan exhaled sharply. Meeting adjourned. He didn't like being summoned. Especially not by the man who had retired a decade ago, but still managed to wield influence like oxygen. The drive to Stee, Mary's hospital, was quiet. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Morning rush hour, horns, people late for work. Ethan watched them with the detached gaze of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to rush for anything other than profit. He found his father sitting by the window, looking out at the lake. The heart monitor beeped softly beside him. You look good, Ethan said. George turned slowly. Alive. Thanks to her. Ethan sighed. Dad, don't you dad me, George interrupted. You fired a woman who saved my life. Ethan's jaw tightened. It wasn't personal. HR handles those decisions. That's the problem, George said quietly. Everything you do now is impersonal. Automated, cold. Ethan crossed his arms. You taught me structure. I taught you integrity, George said. You traded it for control. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet hum of medical equipment filled the space between them. Finally, George said, Do you even know why she was late? Ethan looked away. No. She stopped to help me, George said. Collapsed on the street, rain pouring down. Everyone passed by except her. Ethan blinked. The image unsettled him. She didn't know who you were? Of course not. That's what makes it extraordinary. George leaned forward, eyes sharp despite his frailty. I want her reinstated. Ethan hesitated. I can do that. No, George said. You'll do more. You'll see her. Ethan frowned. See her? Yes. Look her in the eye. Thank her. Then figure out how to build a company that deserves people like her. Ethan exhaled slowly. You're asking me to fix something that's not broken. George smiled sadly. Oh, it's broken, son. You just can't see the cracks from your penthouse. Grace Turner didn't know any of this. She was sitting at her kitchen table, bills spread out like silent judgment. The eviction notice glared from the corner. Rent was 2 weeks overdue, and the severance pay barely covered groceries. Lucas sat on the floor nearby, building a Lego tower. Mom, if I build the biggest tower, will that make us rich? Grace laughed softly. If only it worked that way. He looked up, serious. It will one day. You'll see. She reached over and ruffled his hair. You've got more faith than anyone I know. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number again. Hello? Ms. Turner? The voice was formal but kind. This is Michael Grant, assistant to Mr. George Whitman. He asked me to personally invite you to lunch today, if you're available. Grace froze. Lunch? With Mr. Whitman? Yes, ma'am. At the Lakeview Conservatory. Noon. She glanced at the clock. 10:20. Her clothes were old, her nails chipped, her shoes worn. I'll be there. The Lakeview Conservatory shimmered with glass and marble. Sunlight cascaded through the tall windows, scattering across the indoor garden. Grace felt small stepping into a place like that. Waiters in crisp uniforms floated between tables, and the air smelled faintly of citrus and elegance. George Whitman sat near the window, dressed in a beige sweater and a smile. Beside him, surprisingly, was Ethan. For a second, Grace froze. She recognized him immediately, the face from company emails and posters. The CEO, the man whose signature had ended her job. George stood when he saw her. "Grace, please, come sit." Ethan rose too, stiffly, buttoning his jacket. "Miss Turner," she nodded politely, avoiding his eyes. "Mar Whitman, Imar Whitman," George chuckled. "Please call me George. And don't worry, I made him come." Grace smiled nervously. "I'm glad you're feeling better, sir." George's tone softened. "Thanks to you. You saved my life." Ethan cleared his throat. "And for that, Miss Turner, I owe you an apology." Grace blinked. "An apology?" "Yes," Ethan said, eyes steady but uncomfortable. "You were treated unfairly. You shouldn't have lost your job." She stared at him for a long moment. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman, but it's fine. I'm used to things like that." George frowned. "You shouldn't be." Ethan's gaze dropped. "I'll arrange your reinstatement immediately." Grace shook her head. "That's kind, but I don't think I could go back." "Why not?" Ethan asked. "Because the job doesn't change the way people see me," she said quietly. "It's not just about cleaning rooms, it's about dignity. And that's not something you can assign with a paycheck." Ethan's face tightened, but he didn't argue. George smiled faintly. "She's right, you know." Ethan leaned back, exhaling. "So what do you suggest I do?" George sipped his tea. "Start by learning what respect looks like from the ground up." After lunch, as Grace walked out of the conservatory, Ethan followed her into the sunlit courtyard. "Ms. Turner," he said, "I'd like to offer you something more suitable, perhaps in guest relations. You'd have better hours, higher pay." Grace shook her head gently. "I appreciate it, but I'm not looking for charity." "This isn't charity," Ethan said, his voice softening. "It's correction." Grace studied him. "Do you have children, Mr. Whitman?" "No." "Then you might not understand what it means to go home at night and pretend everything's fine, just so your child doesn't worry." Her words hit harder than he expected. Ethan looked away, his reflection caught in the glass doors behind her, a man in a tailored suit who suddenly felt like a stranger in his own story. "I'll make it right," he said quietly. Grace smiled faintly. Maybe the best way to make it right is to make it mean something. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in silence. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and stood by the window of his penthouse overlooking the glittering skyline. The city was alive with movement, a living organism made of ambition and desperation. He thought of Grace's words. "It's not just about cleaning rooms. It's about dignity." He remembered his father's eyes, filled with disappointment. He remembered the day his mother died, how his father had buried himself in work and called it strength. Maybe that's where he'd learned to confuse control with success. He poured the bourbon down the sink. 2 days later, George called a board meeting. Ethan walked in, uneasy. He wasn't used to being on the defensive. "Gentlemen," George began, "I've decided to return as chairman emeritus, effective immediately." The directors exchanged glances. Ethan frowned. "Dad, you can't." "I can," George interrupted, "and I am. It's time this company remembers its roots." He turned to the board. "We're launching a new initiative, the Whitman Outreach Program, aimed at supporting community workers, single parents, and low-income employees in hospitality. Ms. Grace Turner will lead it." The room buzzed with whispers. Ethan's jaw dropped. "What?" George smiled. "She has more understanding of people than anyone sitting in this room." "Dad, you can't just appoint someone with no corporate background." "I can," George said again. Because she's the reason I'm alive. And perhaps the reason this company will be too. The board fell silent. All eyes turned to Ethan. He exhaled slowly. If that's your decision, then I'll make sure it works. When Grace got the call, she thought it was a mistake. Director of Outreach? She repeated, disbelief in her voice. Are you sure you meant me? Yes, ma'am, Michael said cheerfully. Mr. Whitman SR insisted. Grace sat in stunned silence. I don't even own a suit, Michael chuckled. You'll fit in just fine. Her first day back at the company wasn't glamorous. The office was smaller than she'd imagined, tucked away on a lower floor. But the title on the door still felt unreal. Grace Turner, Community Relations. When Ethan stopped by that afternoon, she half expected condescension. Instead, he offered a small, genuine smile. How's the view from this side? He asked. Less shiny, she said. But more honest, he nodded. You're right where we need you. Over the next weeks, Grace began meeting employees, the cleaning staff, cooks, maintenance workers, night clerks. She listened to their stories, their frustrations, their dreams. She created new benefits programs, mental health support, and fairer scheduling policies. At first, many were skeptical. Another PR stunt, one janitor muttered. But Grace didn't make speeches. She showed up every day with empathy in action. Word spread quickly. The woman who'd been fired now fought for everyone else. One afternoon, as she left the office, Ethan caught up with her in the elevator. Word is spreading, he said. You're making me look soft, Grace smiled. Or maybe you're finally looking human, he laughed. An actual laugh, unguarded. You're dangerous, Miss Turner. She looked at him, eyes bright. No, Mr. Whitman. I'm necessary. The elevator doors opened, and for the first time, he didn't see an employee walking out. He saw a force of nature, steady, kind, unstoppable. That night, George called Ethan. She's doing good work, isn't she? Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching the lights of downtown flicker through the glass. Better than I expected. George's tone softened. Sometimes the best leaders aren't the ones who climb ladders. They're the ones who hold them steady for others. Ethan smiled faintly. You really like her, don't you? George chuckled. She reminds me of your mother. She never chased power. She carried it quietly. The line went silent for a moment. Maybe, Ethan said. It's time I learned to do the same. Autumn arrived gently over Chicago, trees catching fire in shades of gold, the air crisp with a kind of melancholy that whispered both ending and renewal. Inside the Whitman Foundation headquarters, Grace Turner sat at her desk, surrounded by photos from recent charity events, smiling employees, children in refurbished community centers, families who now had jobs thanks to the outreach program. Each frame was a story of someone finding their way back to dignity. She smiled at one photo in particular, a group of housekeeping staff holding up a banner that read, "Thank you for seeing us." Those 4 words summed up everything she had fought for. The woman who once scrubbed floors now led an organization that gave voice to those who had none. But even as success blossomed around her, Grace carried a quiet awareness that all light casts a shadow. That shadow fell one afternoon in October, when her phone rang and Michael, George Whitman's assistant, spoke in a trembling voice. Grace, it's Amar Whitman. He's not well. The doctors say you and Ethan should come right away. Her heart dropped. Within an hour, she was at the hospital again, the same one where this story had begun. Room 304. The steady beep of monitors filled the air. George looked older, smaller somehow, as if time had finally caught up. Ethan sat beside the bed, his suit jacket discarded, his hands clenched in silence. Grace stepped in quietly. How is he? Ethan looked up, eyes red. Heart failure. They say it's only a matter of time. George stirred, smiling faintly when he saw her. Ah, my angel in sneakers. You came. She knelt beside him, taking his hand gently. Of course I came. "You scared us." He chuckled weakly. "Scaring people keeps me young." She squeezed his hand. "You've done enough of that." Ethan looked away, fighting to hold himself together. He had spent his entire life chasing perfection. Now, in the presence of mortality, it felt meaningless. Over the next few days, Grace and Ethan visited daily. They took turns reading to George, bringing him soup, listening to his old stories about how he built the first Whitman hotel from scratch, how his late wife had been the real backbone, how he'd once almost lost everything and started over. "Money's just the loudest liar in the room," George told Ethan one night. "It tells you that you matter because you have it. But the only thing that makes you matter is how many people can say their lives got better because you existed." Ethan nodded slowly. "I finally get that now." George smiled weakly. "Good. Took you long enough." Grace laughed softly. "He's learning. Because of you," George said. She looked down, embarrassed. "I just did what anyone would." "No," George whispered. "You did what good people used to do, before the world got too proud to kneel beside someone who'd fallen." The room went quiet. Ethan looked at her then, really looked. The woman who had taught him more about leadership than any business school ever could. 2 weeks later, George passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was held on a gray morning at a small chapel overlooking Lake Michigan. The city skyline stood distant behind the mist, as if bowing in respect. Hundreds attended: employees, executives, janitors, bellhops, even people from communities Grace had helped through the outreach program. Every seat was filled, not with mourners, but with gratitude. Ethan stood at the front, his voice steady but soft. "My father built more than hotels. He built second chances. And if there's one thing he'd want us to remember, it's that kindness is the only investment that never loses value." Grace, sitting with Lucas in the second row, wiped tears quietly. When the service ended, Ethan found her outside under the falling leaves. "Thank you for being here," he said. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." He smiled faintly. "He wanted you to have something." From his coat pocket, he pulled a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note in George's careful script. "Grace, you reminded me what the company was meant to stand for. If the world ever makes you doubt your worth again, remember this: the Whitmans may have built hotels, but you built homes for hearts. G.W." A folded document was tucked beneath it, a certificate transferring partial ownership of the Whitman Foundation to her name. Grace's hands shook. "I can't accept this." "You already have," Ethan said gently. "He signed it last week." In the months that followed, life moved in quiet ripples. The foundation flourished. Grace's initiatives expanded across the country: job training programs, mental health counseling for staff, shelters for displaced families. Ethan transformed too. He restructured company leadership, cutting bonuses for top executives to raise wages for frontline workers. He started attending community meetings, not to speak, but to listen. One reporter asked him during a televised interview, "Mr. Whitman, what changed you?" He smiled thoughtfully. "A woman who taught me that saving a life doesn't end with a heartbeat. It starts with what you do next." The clip went viral. People started calling it the Whitman Shift. Business schools studied it. But for Ethan and Grace, it wasn't about legacy. It was about redemption made real. One evening, nearly a year later, Grace stood in front of the new George Whitman Center for Human Dignity. The glass building shimmered under the city lights. Inside, volunteers handed out meals, tutored children, and offered job placements. Lucas, now 9, tugged her sleeve. "Mom, are we famous?" She smiled. "No, honey. We're just trying to make people's days a little better." He grinned. "That's kind of famous," she laughed, pulling him close. "Maybe a little." Behind them, Ethan approached, hands in his pockets. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" She nodded. "He'd be proud." "He would," Ethan said softly. "Of both of us." They walked through the lobby together. Portraits of employees and community members lined the walls. each plaque engraved with a quote from George. "Service is strength. Kindness builds empires that last." Grace paused under one that read, "Sometimes, the person cleaning the floor sees the reflection clearer than the man in the mirror." She smiled. He really did have a way with words. Ethan chuckled. He had a way with truth. As they stepped outside, the night was calm, the city humming with life. "I've been thinking," Ethan said. "The Foundation's next phase, international outreach. We're starting in South America. I want you to lead it." Grace turned, eyes wide. "Me? Who else?" He said, "You've built everything we stand for. It's time the world sees it." She hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready." He smiled gently. "You weren't ready to save my father either." "But you did." She laughed softly. "You always know what to say." "Not always," he admitted. "But when it comes to you, I try harder." Their eyes met again, filled not with romance, but something deeper: respect, admiration, quiet love that didn't need words. Later that night, Grace stood alone by the lakeside. The water rippled softly under the moonlight. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks for George, for Ethan, for every twist of fate that had turned pain into purpose. She thought about that morning long ago, the rain, the stranger collapsing on the pavement, the decision to stop. How one small act had set in motion everything that followed. A voice echoed in her memory, George's voice. "You did what good people used to do." She smiled. "Maybe it's time we start again." Months passed. Seasons shifted. The Foundation's work expanded globally. Grace traveled, spoke at summits, met leaders, yet she never let fame consume her. Every time someone called her hero, she'd laugh and say, "I'm just a mom who stopped for a stranger." Lucas grew up watching her not as a celebrity, but as an example. One night he told her, "Mom, when I grow up, I want to build something like you did." She kissed his forehead. "Then start with kindness. It'll take you further than anything else." On the second anniversary of George's passing, the Whitman family gathered again at the Lakeside Chapel. The service was smaller this time, intimate. Afterward, Ethan and Grace stood by his gravestone. The inscription read, "He lived to remind the powerful that power means nothing without compassion." Ethan placed a single white rose on the marble. "He'd be proud of you," Grace said softly. He turned to her. "He'd be proud of us." For a moment, the breeze carried silence, not empty, but full of meaning. They stood there until the sun dipped below the horizon, golden light spilling across the lake, the same light that had shown the morning Grace saved a stranger's life. That night, a letter arrived at Grace's apartment. No sender, just elegant handwriting. Inside was a copy of an old photo, her kneeling in the rain beside George, her coat under his head, paramedics in the background. On the back, a simple message written by Ethan. One act of kindness started all of this. "Thank you for stopping." She placed the photo in a frame beside Lucas's bed, where the morning sun would hit it every day. And as she turned off the light, she smiled. The kind of smile that knows peace doesn't come from winning, but from choosing good, even when no one's watching. In a world obsessed with power, she proved that the most powerful thing of all is a heart that stops to help.